Welcome everyone to the Lunch and Learn for today. We have Ashley Sayers here.
So we are going to talk about Victorian mourning practices, and then afterward I can take you guys through our historic house because we have it set up for discussing Victorian mourning practices. So I can take you guys through and show you the setup that we have. In today's world, life expectancy is much longer. Mortality rates for babies and young children is low. During the Victorian era, that wasn't the case. Because death was being dealt with on a more frequent basis, the Victorians had strict customs and etiquette that they followed when they were observing the passing of an individual as a way for them to show respect to that person. From how the funeral was conducted to the attire that one wore while they were mourning, superstitions surrounding death, and more. We're going to talk about how they mourned death during the Victorian era. And so we're going to start first with societal customs. For the Victorians, when it came time to mourn the death of a loved one, both men and women visibly mourned, but the etiquette that was followed was much stricter for the women. It was the women who primarily oversaw the funeral practices and the mourning customs that were observed by the family, and everything had to be perfect according to societal expectations of the time. If women began socializing too early, if they didn't wear the appropriate color, or if they provided cards with the wrong size of border, it would be seen as disrespect for the dead. We kind of start with alerting society to the death of someone, and it started with the door of the home. The front door would be adorned with a black crepe badge, which you see in this picture, and I actually have some crepe fabric, so you guys can pass this around. You see how it feels. So you'd have this black crepe badge on the door, and having one on the door, it was universally understood that a death had occurred in the family. You also had the funeral notice that would spread word of the death as well. So these things, they would let you know that not only had someone passed, but it would let you know when the funeral would be. And then once you went inside the home, you would see the blinds, the shutters, the drapes, they'd all be shut. And you could see that from the outside too, so that would alert people that you were mourning. Once word of a death had spread, the family in mourning was paid condolence calls by friends and neighbors. During these calls on the family, visitors would bring food such as meats, pies, cakes, and breads, among other items. The food that was brought by others was a big help to the family that was mourning, especially for the women, because that meant they didn't have to worry about cooking meals while preparing for the upcoming funeral, as well as for after the funeral when people gathered together for a post-funeral meal or for taking care of any family that came from out of town for the funeral. All right, so now their attire. Now when it came to the attire, Victorians wore mourning clothes and accessories for a lot longer than we do today, and there were guidelines to follow about what to wear and for how long you would wear it. Again, that's going to mostly be for the women that were in mourning. Mourning attire was determined by how much time had passed since someone's death and how close a person was to the deceased. The closer you were to the deceased and the deeper you mourned determined the color that you wore while you were mourning. If a woman was in deep mourning, she would wear a black dress that was free of shine and heavily trimmed in crepe. So you can see that in this image right here. Now, because silk crepe started smelling unpleasant and became discolored quickly, deep mourning attire was called widow's weeds. From black attire, women would graduate to a deep purple or a mauve, and then to lavender or a black and white print. Mourning could last a full year for women, but some chose to mourn for the rest of their lives, such as Queen Victoria did after Prince Albert had passed away. Now, men, on the other hand, they didn't have much about their attire that they had to change during mourning, since they tended to wear black every day anyway.
Question.
Yeah.
So on the maroon to the lilac, was that a gradual process or was it either or?
It was a gradual process.
So if they were in purple for the rest of their life, they were in mourning for the rest of their life.
Usually if they were in mourning for the rest of their life, they would be in black. So that would be deep mourning, and so they would stay in black colors.
That's interesting.
So men, like I said, they tended to wear black every day. So they didn't have quite as strict things that they had to follow as the women did. But it would be common to see men wearing crepe hat bands or armbands, especially if they would be part of the funeral service for the deceased. They also didn't have to mourn as long as women did either. So they would only mourn up to 6 months or even less. And then for children, they were not typically put into a mourning attire because it wasn't seen as good for their health or spirits. But if one did want to dress a child for mourning, you would typically put them in white clothing with black sashes or armbands or dark velvet trimmings. And in the last slide, I didn't talk on it too much, but there would be accessories too that you would accompany for the women usually. So you would have the hair accessories, parasol, fans. You'd want to make sure you were representing in your mourning. Now, when it came to the funeral, funerals were generally held in the home, and everything that was needed for the funeral would be brought by the undertaker. The body would be laid out in the front parlor of the home. It would either be in a coffin, which is 8-sided and tapered, or in a casket, which is rectangular, and it would be placed on a bier, which is a movable frame, as you can see in this image right here. The coffin or casket would be covered with tassels and swags of black fabric. Chairs would be set up around the coffin or casket for those who sat up with the dead. It was a Southern practice that was started to keep the body clean of flies. And then after embalming became standard, sitting with the dead became more a matter of showing respect for the deceased rather than keeping them free of flies. Now, even embalming was done in the home. Undertakers would bring with them a portable cooling table, and when we go through the house afterwards, you will get to see a portable cooling table. So they would take portable cooling table, they'd lay the body on it, and bring all the necessary equipment to prepare the body for. Now, by the 1900s or early 1900s, funerals were increasingly held in the undertaker's establishment, and they called them the funeral parlor after the front parlor where funerals had originally been held in the home. Now, because funeral homes started being called the funeral parlor, front parlors became known as living rooms so they could disassociate from funerals and death. We also have flowers. Flowers were really important during Victorian mourning. Flowers or floral tributes, they were an important custom for Victorian funerals. Now, traditionally, they would have arrangements in the shape of the cross or anchor, which signified hope. In the Victorian era, people used flowers to say things, all kinds of things. There were even books written about the language of flowers. So the flowers that were used in funerals would have been chosen very carefully because you didn't want to say the wrong thing, especially during a funeral. Among the flowers that you'd see in funeral arrangements were lilies, and lilies represent purity, life, remembrance, and rebirth. If there was a funeral that was being held for someone that had lived into old age, it was customary to have a sheaf of wheat with a black ribbon tying it together. And you can kind of see that right here in that picture. Now, if the deceased had been part of a fraternal organization such as the Masons, there could be floral tributes from that organization with their symbols as well. In this, you'll see in the house as well when we go through there. So having reminders of the deceased, it was another common mourning practice for the Victorians, so they were remembrances. Some of the memorializations created by the Victorians, they probably seem macabre to us today, but things like mourning jewelry, hair wreaths, photos of the dead, and memorial cards, they were very common practice during the Victorian era. Taking photos with the deceased, it was usually a mother or parents parents with their child, and they'd be holding them. These photos, it would be a final way to memorialize a deceased loved one. Photos of living siblings posing with a dead sibling were also taken, so it wasn't just limited to the parents. It didn't matter though who was in the photo with them. The deceased would be dressed, their hair would be styled, and they would be posed to look as if they were still alive. Sometimes they'd be shown with closed eyes, but other times they would paint on their eyelids to make it look like their eyes were open and as if they were still alive. These photos would sometimes be the only photo that a family may have with their deceased loved one as well. Another way to remember a deceased loved one was with a hair wreath, which is what this is right here. Hair wreaths were made using the hair of the deceased as well as hair from living family members. The hair would be wrapped around a wire form that was sometimes in the shape of a horseshoe, and it would be displayed with the open end up towards heaven. The wreath would be mounted on a fabric background and placed in a shadow box for display like this one. A lot of hair wreaths could be 18 inches or more in diameter, so they could be fairly large. So similarly, mourning jewelry, which was made from the deceased's hair as well. It was a prevalent practice, although it was much, much smaller than hair wreaths. Examples of mourning jewelry include brooches, bracelets, earrings, rings, and these pieces would be worn during the mourning period. While I was doing research for this, I found a quote that said, "The imperishable nature of human hair and the great brilliancy and beauty which it retains long after it has been severed, even after the person to whom it once belonged has passed away, have always rendered it one of the most cherished mementos of absent or departed friends." So hair art was an enduring way to express one's love for someone. Now, we also had memorial cards like this one that you see up here. They would be considered much less macabre to our sensibilities today in 2025. They would be printed in black and silver on white and embossed with traditional symbols of grief, such as the inverted torch, the weeping willow, kneeling female mourners, and a shrouded urn. The card would also contain the name and age of the person who had passed, the date and place of burial, as well as possibly a verse or some other text. The cards would be mounted and then framed to be put on display in the home of the bereaved. They were intended to be a reminder to offer prayers and for the family who lost their loved ones. So in this one, you could see the name. So it said Thaddeus Stevenson, born July 31st, I think that says 1873, and died April 13th, 1916. And then it has the age on there, even down to the day. So it says age 42 years, I think 8. Sometimes it's kind of hard to see in the old font. 8 months and 12 days. And then there's a little verse at the bottom. Yes, ma'am.
So would those things stay up always, or would they be taken down after the time?
So this for sure may be up because it was a way to remember them. So that could have been up the whole time, and the hair wreath may have been as well too. I mean, this isn't mourning so much, but like hair jewelry and hair crafts, that was done even if there wasn't someone that had passed. So it was just a way to like show love for somebody. It was there was a whole crafting section during the Victorian era. I think it was called fancy work, and creating stuff with hair was included in that. So it'd be like knitting and crocheting, and then your hair work was part of that. So these two things specifically could have very likely been displayed permanently. So
the mortuary cards too, remembrance, they could be sent to family that couldn't.
They could, yes. They could be sent to family that couldn't attend, because not everybody could come from out of town. I would imagine more often than not, people couldn't come from out of town in those days. And then the last thing, we're going to talk about superstitions, because we can't talk about mourning practices of the Victorians without talking about some of the superstitions that they had regarding death, especially because some of these superstitions influenced some of the customs that they followed in mourning. So there were many, many superstitions that the Victorians had, but two were pretty common. One, it was customary to stop all of the clocks in the house at the time of death of the deceased and not to restart them until after the funeral had happened. Superstition held that if you immediately restarted the clocks, it would lead to another death. The bereaved family would also drape fabric over all of the mirrors in the home. So this was actually tied to 2 different superstitions. Both of them, though, resulted in death. So one superstition said that if the casket was reflected in a mirror, that it would lead to another death. And then the other said that if a person saw their own reflection in a mirror soon after there was a death in the family, then that would lead to their own death. So we didn't want anything reflected in the mirrors immediately after someone passed away. So the customs and beliefs that surrounded death for the Victorians, they've evoked the terms of cult of death, cult of mourning, and I mean, the Victorians are seen as more macabre than we are today as a society. However, every mourning practice or custom during the Victorian era had a reason behind it, it had a meaning behind it, and they were all products of their societal views of the day, just as our mourning practices and customs today are a product of our societal views. So it all was influential, and I mean, even today we still wear black, not as long. Some of those traditions we have continued on as well. Not the hair wreaths or the hair jewelry, that one's gone. All right, so if you guys want to, I can take you guys through our historic house. One of the people that owned the house, his name was F.C. Hawkins. We actually have it set up for his funeral. He did have his funeral in the home, so we have it set up for him. So like the funeral notice that we have on the door when we come in, it has his name and his funeral date and when he passed, and we have it set up as if we are getting ready to have his funeral.
So is that his hair then, or is that somebody?
That actually did not belong to the family.
Oh,
so that's another family's hair. We don't have a lot of stuff that belonged to the family. There's only like 3 pieces of furniture that we have and a quilt. So you can look through this window here and then this one onto the back porch, and that will show you the cooling table that would have been brought and all the embalmer's tools.
They call it cooling if it
had holes in it. It was so the body could lay out.
So that is wood?
It is wood, yeah. I think it would have been, for the portable one, the wood would have been easier for a portable version. Because when I was doing my research, I read like some undertakers, I mean, they were not right near where someone had passed, so they'd have to travel quite a bit to get there. So I would think the lighter you had something, yeah. So in here we have our clock that's been stopped and our mirrors that have been covered. And then we have it set up for a meal for after the funeral as well. And then the next room we're going to go into is the front parlor. So we've got the mourning jewelry on the table. We have the coffin and then the hair wreath and then another mirror covered.
So explain the difference again, coffin and casket.
So a coffin is 8-sided and tapered, and then a casket is just rectangular. But regardless, they would both, when it was in the house, they'd both be placed on a bier, which are those wooden legs on the bottom.
So why would they use one and not the other?
Cost, it could have been preference as well. So we do have a memorial card here on this wall, and then some cards like you would have, like your calling cards and things that you would use during the mourning period. And you'll see on some of the cards, the borders I mentioned at the beginning, those could not be the wrong width or it would be seen as disrespect for the dead. Etiquette was followed by everyone, but it was stricter for the women. They did one slightly wrong thing and they would be seen as being disrespectful to the deceased. So yeah, we're in the bedroom. You'll see a lot of the accessories for their attire. And we've got 2 more mirrors that are covered.
So if flowers are so important, what happens if they died in the winter and there were no flowers?
That is a good question, and one I am not sure I can answer.
Well, I know a lot of times they make paper flowers.
That is true. They did make paper flowers quite a bit, so they could have done something similar.
Wax flowers. Yeah, wow, there you go.